I was invited here. I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much to speak about partition. And so I decided that if we're going to speak about this subject, I thought I would start with this image of a photograph that was taken in 1947 of a librarian at the Calcutta National Library who was required to separate these books. Who was required to separate basically knowledge between, there was sort of a pile of books. It just is required to separate this knowledge on one side going to Pakistan and one side going to India. And so in many respects, I think this photograph really conveys a lot of the ways in which our histories have also been divided, and the histories that we are often taught, whether they're taught in India or in Pakistan, they are taught from a very nationalist perspective, right? Mm-hmm. So by nationalist, of course, there are many different kinds of nationalisms, but the nationalism that we are chiefly concerned with here are those dominant forms of nationalism guided by the state and other authorities that essentially dictate what is the definition of this nation, right? So if you can move the slide one slide forward. Okay, so one of the things that we see right away when we think about 1947, one thing is that we cannot even understand the independence of India outside of the creation of Pakistan, right? Those two things cannot be separated. That's one thing. And when we think about independence from colonial rule, from British rule, so there's sort of a lot of prehistory we have to understand before 1947 as well, in order to understand what happened in 1947. But unfortunately, one of the problems that has guided a lot of this history writing after 1947 is that there are these nationalist modes through which that history is told, right? So, for instance, one kind of theory that has been quite used to a long extent, right, is this divide and rule theory, right? Mm-hmm. Which, on the face of it, seems very common sense. That, okay, the British arrived to India, they separated Hindus and Muslims. I mean, there was certainly the politicization of religious identities. Mm-hmm. That means that people began to invest in seeing themselves as Hindu or as Muslim in particular ways, right? But this idea that the British sort of came in and simply divided and ruled is very simplistic. That's actually not true, right? The other theory is that, I mean, there's definitely the British played a very strong role, so I want to talk about that, but it's not so simple as divide and rule. The second theory that has been proffered, right, is that these are two nations. There were always two nations, that there were always this Hindu nation and this Muslim nation that had been kind of preformed long before 1947. So actually both of these ways to think about what happened in 1947 falls short of what actually took place. Really, if we want to understand what happened and the context of what happened in 1947 is we have to really understand these particularities of Indian society, the particular structural problems that essentially kind of created the situation in which this division occurred, right? Which was a division that did not actually, was not some pre-planned thing. It's not something that was planned for years and years in advance. It actually was very chaotic, as we know, right? I mean, sort of several things happened, right? One thing that happened was that certainly many Indian leaders at the time, national leaders, felt that the British leaving India was imminent. So if we look at, for example, especially by 1942, when you have the Quit India movement, and at that time, many of the Congress leaders were put in jail, many other nationalist leaders were put in jail. So there was this sense that definitely the British are going to leave. The question was the terms on which they were going to leave. So if you can move 2 slides back. One of the chief concerns is that when we think about who was ultimately involved in deciding those terms of independence and partition, when we think about sort of who the key players were, right? On the one hand, you have British figures, you have Indian Congress leaders, you have the Muslim League, right? These are sort of major players, right? But it was actually on the terms of the British on which independence and partition occurred, right? So the policies put in place by the colonial state, the way the state had been organized, and I think last time I spoke a little bit about that the 19th and 20th centuries, what you see in basically in South Asia is the most highly centralized state that had existed to date, right? Was under the British, right? This very idea of India as some kind of territorially bounded entity, right, was something that was chiefly sort of engineered, as it were, by British views of this landmass and the peoples who lived in them, and for whom they felt that they were responsible for dictating the terms of their political future, right? Of which they claimed that they had no real rights to essentially make that political future, and that's precisely why you had men like Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, all belonging to this sort of elite cadre of national leaders who essentially used the rules and tools of colonial authority and turned it against their erstwhile colonial masters, but ultimately within that same framework of parliamentary politics and the kinds of problems that were engineered as a result out of that, right? So, आगे बढ़ते हैं slide. The first thing, is this map, the map. The next slide. The first thing we see is this map, right? This is a map of the British Indian Empire as it was conceived by the British themselves in 1909. And so if you see the pink shaded area, there's a legend on the bottom left of the map, which says the notation, the guiding notation. So I don't know if you can see that, but basically pink refers to Hindus, and brown is refers to Sikhs. Green, they have listed Mohammedan, even though of course we know that it's Muslim, not Mohammedan. Then yellow is Buddhists, and this blue is Christian, and then there's like a grayish color at the bottom, animists. Okay, so if you see this map, you see something quite interesting, right? You see sort of this very ready-made sketch that basically India is almost entirely Hindu, and what you have here in the northwest geographic region, all green. So this is again the British imagination, the British map makers' imagination. So when we see maps, maps are not some ready-made instruments of unfiltered objective knowledge, right? I mean, the map maker will always put his or her perspective onto what they think they want to show, right? So what does this map leave out?
The Muslims in the main landmass.
Yes, exactly. So there's like a lot of things. So I'll give a slide for. So at the same time, the British were also kind of putting these maps together. They also had these kinds of maps, right? Which gave some kind of percentages that the prevailing religions, Hindus here. So the darker the shade, so it's like the dark red, it's over 80% Hindu, 40 to 80% is a lighter shade of red or pink, and 0 to 40% of the population they showed. Okay, so if you move the map forward, one more, and then you get into the completely complicated picture, right? So I mean, so you see that here again, there's something going on. Obviously, the British do have this idea of these categories, Hindu and Muslim, but ultimately the structural problems are that this doesn't mesh very well with the fact of local provincial politics and local provincial sort of regional identities, right? And that's kind of at the core of what so if we think of partition as sort of from the frame of the high politics, right? Now, this lecture that I'm giving today is really about partition from that perspective, from the level of the state, from the negotiations happening at the level of the state. I haven't yet broached the topic of violence, which oftentimes, you know, I mean, that we cannot talk about one without the other, so I will broach that in a minute. But the important thing here to recognize is that there is clearly a problem with the actual way in which the colonial state is envisioning, on the one hand, compartmentalized communal politics, Hindu and Muslim, and on the other hand, these regional, I mean, you have sort of a very complex, diverse state of affairs, right? I mean, you also have many princely states that are ruled at this time, in a manner what the British were referred to as indirect rule, right? This is not through direct rule. So again, much of this you may already be aware of. I just wanted to start from this perspective to sort of give you a sense of where the grounds through which this is being articulated. Okay, if you go through steps to 3 more aage. So, of course, the British controlled, right? So the other problem you have is that the British controlled everything at this unitary center, like the Delhi, the sort of central state apparatus was entirely in the hands of the British, right? Under any kind of sort of these maps, right? In these maps, Muslims then remained as a perpetual minority. So when we think about sort of the ways in which the modern national imperial structures of the state, right? They're very different than if you can imagine like sort of pre-modern, medieval, if you've studied, questions of, you've already looked at various Muslim dynasties and other questions, right? I mean, this is a very different state. These are not the same at all, okay? Because the British introduced all sorts of new, I mean, it's really kind of what you can call a kind of epistemological violence, what the British do, right? It's like it's a violence on not just a coercive violence that involves military coercion. It's a violence on the basis of language, in which English becomes the language of the upper class and the elites, and it's a violence on the basis of understanding this place as being guided through either these religiously bounded identities, and through these categories that the British are introducing, right? So this is not simply just another phase of history. It is a deeply violent and deeply sort of, it's an epistemological break from the past, right? Now, even under these terms, by the time you get to sort of the 1930s and 1940s, this idea that there was sort of this unified Pakistan movement. I mean, one of the prevailing, I think, problems with understanding this Pakistan movement here, oftentimes in Pakistan studies and other contexts, one is taught that this all started with, Syed Ahmad Khan. That he started this university in Aligarh and he had this problem with the Congress and so on and so forth. And so oftentimes, either the history of Pakistan starts there, which is actually false. To start the history from the 19th century of the Pakistan movement, before the word Pakistan was even coined, before anyone had this imagination of Muslim nationalism, that itself is a problem. Not just that, but what you see is that, you don't even have, even after the Lahore Resolution, right, which is when you have a number of political leaders join together, the Muslim League gets together, right, and sort of make this declaration around sort of this business of what is this Pakistan, what is this demand going to be about a Muslim homeland, right? Even after 1940, it's not clear any kind of territorial boundaries of Pakistan, right? And in fact, Muslims didn't even align with an all India political organization called the Muslim League consistently even from the 1920s, 30s, right? This was sort of something, again, that was fought over. There was, again, these massive contradictions with what to do between this unitary center around which the British had this idea of Hindus, Muslims, and these provincial localities, right? The fact is you had like several provinces that were Muslim majority, and then you had several provinces that were Muslim minority. And so how do you gel all of these things, right? How were these kind of put together? Okay, I'll move one slide ahead. So many of you probably already know about this terminology, right? That Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, who's a barrister, he coins this term Pakistan, P for Punjab, A for Afghanistan or the Northwest Frontier provinces, K for Kashmir, and B for, or rather, Stan from Balochistan. But when Chaudhry Rahmat Ali actually coined this, right, it didn't take off. Nobody cared. Nobody was discussing Pakistan in 1933 as it comes to be sort of then in its sort of what happens in 47, right? So there's not, again, you cannot draw a direct historical line from 1933 to 1947. Again, sort of, so I think one of the problems here too is that there are these particular references that are made to how the term comes about, and there's somehow like a seamless narrative that there is this name, there's Lahore Resolution, and suddenly you have this Pakistan idea, and then everybody gets behind it. That's not actually what happened, right? There's a lot of debate. I mean, even if you look at, say, for example, just at the Punjab alone, there's several different political organizations that are competing for electoral power. And these, again, this electoral power is also, it's a limited franchise. It's not everyone who is casting a ballot. This was not at all some kind of universal franchise. And it's also occurring in a context where there's no such thing as real kind of citizenship, right? I mean, nobody is a citizen at this point. Everyone is still subjects of the British Empire. Okay, so if we move like aage on one more slide. So these are, I'm sure many of you already know that these are all the Muslim majority provinces, Balochistan, Sindh, Northwest Frontier provinces, Punjab and Bengal. And then of course you have this question of Kashmir, where will Kashmir go? And in 1947, there's another war around this business of Kashmir, because Kashmir, right, is ruled by a Hindu princely ruler with a majority Muslim peasantry, right? If we turn now to looking at the Indian nationalist narrative, what typically happens in the Indian nationalist narrative is that you have this story of Jinnah, where he gets blamed as somehow concocting this whole Pakistan idea as a way to divide India, that he was somehow, you know, and if you actually look at some of these political cartoons that were put out by newspapers, you know, which were under the patronage of the Indian National. In those newspapers, Jinnah was oftentimes compared to Hitler or Frankenstein, and somehow he was doing some kind of evil dividing, you know, business, right? And in fact, many of you probably already know that when the BJP leader, there was a BJP leader who came to Pakistan and visited the grave of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and said, well, actually, he was a secular man, right? Who did not, right? This idea that he was secular, even that in the now Indian nationalist imagination is so, Jinnah is seen amongst Indians as so somehow harboring this ultimate Muslim kind of almost theological, right? They think of him as an Islamist, which is laughable, right? Whereas I think on this side of the border, you get a narrative in which somehow Gandhi is responsible, or Gandhi was somehow like, you know, making these machinations with the Indian Congress, and somehow he's responsible. But again, these are very, very problematic and extremely, they fall short of, again, what took place, right? Because it would be interesting actually to think about Jinnah and Gandhi, both of them, if they came from this region of Gujarat, right? And it would be interesting to kind of think if, like, I wonder sometimes if instead of English, they spoke to one another in Gujarati, what might have happened, or what kind of conversations they might have had if they were sort of, again, operating in a system outside of just that kind of British parliamentary, supposedly democratic, but really kind of these structural particularities of the state. Okay, so if we go to, the 25, slide 25. बहुत ही आगे
चलो
जी आ जाए. So what begins to happen in basically around 1947, we have the issue of the British, right? So on the one hand, they have their own exigencies going on with the war coming to an end in Europe. There's a whole business of World War II. And so one of the things that they begin to sort of think about is like getting out of India quickly. And so they pull out actually 6 months earlier than they were scheduled to leave, which throws a lot of things into complete and utter chaos. If you look at the Boundary Commission reports that they produced around this time in 46 and in 47, there was a whole committee of British men that gathered together to produce the boundaries, and these boundaries right through Punjab, right? And if you look at the ways in which they're talking about this, they want to make it seem, I mean, there's mass violence going on between Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs at this time. And they actually are not talking about this violence at all. There's a complete kind of disconnect on one hand, even though they're getting reports of the violence, because of these boundary commissions. They want to make the appearance that they're leaving India and that they're leaving on terms that are very clean and very seamless. There's a seamless transition of power going on, even though clearly there was a lot of chaos. And there was a gentleman by the name of Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who was put in charge of the Boundary Commission, and he was also put in charge with drawing these lines on the map before the end of British rule. And he was given some 5 or 6 weeks to do so, and he had never been to India before. So, I mean, there was no concern here as far as the British right? There was no concern here about the welfare of the people. There was no sense that this was an issue about safety or law and order. When the British left, there's a complete disintegration of the military sort of structures of power, which had already been coming under threat by various strikes. Many of you probably already know Subhash Chandra Bose, who was in charge of the INA, the Indian National Army. He argues that this is how we should get the British out of India. We should actually build our own army. We should desert the British Indian Army, create our own army. And so there's already sort of a lot of threats that the British Indian Army is facing. And of course, the Punjab is a major recruiting ground for the military. So when these borders are being drawn, most people don't even know, right? I mean, many people do not come to know that these boundaries are being drawn at the highest levels. Some of them don't even know what's going on. Their first experience of these boundaries are through violence, that some communities are kind of coming into their villages and so on and so forth, particularly in the rural areas. They are sort of experiencing these lines being drawn on the map. So that is sort of another sort of question that gets broached when we start thinking about this division. And if you go to the next slide, you see sort of the mass kind of displacement, right? Some people call this migration. I don't like to call this migration. It's actually mass displacement, and it's the largest mass displacement of human beings in modern history. We're talking about millions of people who become refugees almost overnight, who are crossing what become these borders, right? Many of them fleeing violence in various parts of Punjab and also Bengal, as you get this east and West Pakistan, which, by the way, again, was not Jinnah's vision. I think he was known to have said, I did not ask for this mutilated, moth-eaten Pakistan. Right? That was not actually the demand that he had been making. It was not actually on territorial grounds. Nonetheless, I mean, I think the idea here is to sort of think critically about the ways in which boundaries and modern national boundaries in particular, right, are being cut across what were formerly known as flexible frontier zones, right? So as opposed to, say, the medieval period or earlier period of history, where cultural difference or otherness is not seen in terms of Hindu, Muslim, etc. It's being seen as like, these are the people who live on that side of the river. These are the people who live on this side of the river. Those people who live in that side of the jungle. These are the people that live on this side of the jungle or mountain, etc. Now you have a boundary that's actually cutting through massive sort of geographical shared spaces like Punjab, where the culture is essentially the same, language is the same. The only difference really here is religion, and it's ostensibly on those lines that this division then sort of begins to take place. And if you move the slide one more, there's a poem by, this is a poem actually by the British poet W.H. Auden about Cyril Radcliffe. in which he says here about Cyril Radcliffe that at one point in the poem, he said, shut up in a lonely mansion with police night and day, patrolling the gardens to keep assassins away. He got down to work to the task of settling the fate of millions. The maps at his disposal were out of date and the census returns almost certainly incorrect. But there was no time to check them, no time to inspect contested areas. The weather was frightfully hot and a bout of dysentery kept him constantly on the trot. But in 7 weeks it was done. The frontiers decided, a continent for better or worse divided. The next day he sailed for England, where quickly forgot the case, as a good lawyer must. Return he would not, afraid, as he told his club that he might get shot. So, I mean, you know, this is the British perspective on the partition, right? So this is sort of an interesting perspective. But if we kind of think more critically about what's happening on the ground, you see sort of a different kind of story. And this is where we run into some sort of trouble as historians, because how do we tell the story of this? Because so much of what transpired in 47, you know, we don't have many eyewitness reports, were not written down at that time. There was a lot of, again, chaos on the ground. And so if the historian wants to write the story of ordinary people and what happened to them, they have to rely on oral testimonies, right? Which again, we start collecting much, much later and much after the fact. And there's a lot of trauma here that has sort of, I mean, I think that's one of the least talked about phenomena of partition, is this kind of trauma that gets passed down from generation to generation in all of these communities who were displaced across these borders and these boundaries. But I'll stop there. I mean, this is sort of a kind of more general introduction. So if you have any particular questions, please leave them.
A little bit
Yes.
When was the borders announced? It was.
So I mean, this is really, so on the one hand, the radio announcements go out on the 14th and 15th of August, 1947, but the borders are not announced until like almost like a month later. So you know, even though you have June, July, August, there's mass violence going on in the Punjab. You're having reports even of this violence that get all the way to the viceroy's home, who are, you know, having these lovely dinner parties, and they're not really doing anything about the violence, right? In that sense. So the borders are not announced over a month. It's over a month in some instances.
And then how a person in a village finds out, let's say a person living on really a border, let's say Wagah, and how does he find out that whether he's in Pakistan or in India?
Exactly. So some people found out through the radio. Some people found out through rumors and gossip. For some people, the very first time they knew that there's a border being created were that there were people with swords coming to murder them. That was their first experience of knowing that there's now a border and I'm not in the place where I'm supposed to be. Like, I'm literally being killed and, you know, out of my, and sort of sent violently out of my home. So there was like a lot of chaos. I mean, a lot of people did not understand.
Lahore didn't know. I'll share, there's a very nice documentary next. So the Indian Hindu from Lahore, he said, we didn't know, they were all waiting whether Lahore will go to India or Pakistan. The Hindu community was just waiting. Very
Same
odd.
happened with Gurdaspur.
And there's only 30 or so kilometers between Amritsar and Lahore. It's not very far, right? There were many communities who had a home in one city and a business in another. It was not sort of seen again as sort of these radically distinct places, which is now how we experience them, you know, so.
And my next question is, was it according to some, the borders were according to some administrative boundaries which were then said that this tehsil is going, or this
population.
Well, so one of the problems is that they're actually, that poem that Auden says, right? The census reports, those numbers are actually out of date. That's one issue, is that they actually were using out of date information.
What I'm surprised at is, there's a place in Pakistan which intrudes into India, which is hardly a kilometer wide. and it goes 5 kilometers inside India like a finger. Let's say frankly, well, there's no other way how to describe it. Well, that's such a surprising thing. How could a person be drawing a border which goes like this and comes back? There is no sense in that.
So that's just it, right? Because we assume that modern states are very rational and that the boundaries that they're creating are out of some kind of reasonable measures, right? I mean, so the claim is made that they're doing this in a rational way. That's the claim that is made. That is the rhetoric that is used. But the actual practice of that, if you see these boundary commission notes, the British officials are drawing like doodling on the notes. They're not present even in some ways because they just want to get out of there. And so various sort of, I mean, in some cases, the border even cut through homes, particular villages. And people did not know that that border was there. So that border then sort of, there are several years, right, after 47. This is not something that just happens at 47 and is over. There's several years after 1947 in which those particular boundaries then have to become sort of securitized by the state, where particular military personnel are sent there, right? And as for these at the level of the tehsil and stuff like that, again, this is happening in a very haphazard manner in which local opportunists are also in the moment kind of looking for a grab of power and sort of some kind of sovereign power in that moment, right? There's a lot of opportunists also arise in moments of political chaos who then will grab power. But the greatest, perhaps, tragedy, I think, of 1947 is the massive sort of sexual violence, which, I mean, of women in particular, right? Massive kind of violence, which really, I think, in many respects, inaugurates a whole new way of thinking about women's bodies, which now are sort of seen to be, it's on those bodies that you write the national boundaries and borders. That is literally what happens when these communities become weaponized against one another by using women's bodies. And in fact, I would even go as far as theorizing and arguing that if we think about this particular moment, for the massive violence against women that takes place is actually inaugurates, I mean, this whole era, this 47 inaugurates an era of dispossession, displacement, dismemberment, and dislocation, right? This is what 1947, and discrimination inaugurates all of these things, which actually we have to kind of think of critically. So when we think now about what's happening both in India and in Pakistan, we think about the ways in which minorities, for example, are treated. And, you know, we have to think pretty critically about sort of this moment as inaugurating a lot of that, because oftentimes I think the narrative is that, oh, this is how it's always been. This is how people have always done this, you know, forever. No, there are historical processes that actually make possible grave kinds of violence, right? And so from there you can sort of see, and again, like I mentioned, the violence against women, if we kind of revisit this moment to understand where all of that antagonism comes from, because of course there's pre-modern forms of misogyny and sexism against women, but 1947 you have whole-scale slaughter and rape and violence against women that really, I think, in many respects, sort of again inaugurates the sort of what is possible, what is sort of possible or imaginable to do to women in the conditions of these creation of nations. We think of nations as sort of natural. They're not at all natural. There's nothing natural about a nation. Nothing at all natural about a nation. These are all politically carved and sort of historically contingent processes in which
mostly based on, as Chomsky says, on violence.
Yes, the modern state is
those
inaugurated.
Boundaries are so unnatural, especially for Europe. They've been through hundreds of years of wars to have those nations.
Exactly, yes.
You mentioned Radcliffe. He came without preparation. He hadn't been here before. He had to do his job very quickly. And as a conclusion, you draw that the line was drawn very hastily and without much thought. But doesn't that incident show that he didn't do it? He didn't have time. He had no expertise. that maybe this was always predetermined? And do you agree with the fact that the partition line goes in favor of towards the Indian side rather than the Pakistani side, number one? And number two, the violence you've mentioned, is this primarily, am I correct or am I incorrect by saying that is this violence primarily between Bengali Hindus and Muslims and Punjabi Muslims and Punjabi Sikhs? Is it Hindu versus Muslim, or is it Bengali Hindu versus Bengali Muslim and Punjabi Muslim versus Punjabi Sikh? Because the violence in the rest of India, like places like Orissa or Hyderabad or UP, that, am I correct in saying or incorrect that that does not reflect that level of violence that you had in these two regions?
Well, that's where the boundaries were being drawn, right? So those
Yes,
were the
yes.
most sort of intense. But at the same time, there's lots of other boundaries being drawn that we do not hear about. So, for example, in the case of Hyderabad, 1948, you have the Indian army that forcibly annexes the state of Hyderabad, right? And there's still those reports are not being released to the public about how many thousands of people. Actually, there's a Sundar Lal Committee report in which you see, there's like about at least 50,000 Muslims who are killed by the Indian army in Hyderabad state.
That was an attack of trying to, topple the Nizam of Hyderabad.
Yes.
Like an attack on them to,
Yes.
like sort of like something.
Forcibly to annex them within this sort of new imagination of what is territorial India, right? So on the one hand, so Pakistan inherits all of these really messy frontiers that the British could never ever actually conquered in the first place, like what is called the the Indo-Afghan borderlands, right? The British were never actually there completely and held on to that place politically, right? And so Pakistan ends up inheriting a lot of messy frontiers, like what is in Waziristan, other regions, right? As for like India, Pakistan, what you have is the fact that in Delhi, you already had a central state apparatus. When the divisions are made, Pakistan, what is now conceived as the new state of Pakistan, has no central state apparatus. They are literally bringing on the trains pens, paper, pencils, and chairs to put in Karachi for a new capital to be built. Karachi was never set up as a sort of capital administrative city, right?
Wasn't it the capital of province of Sindh at that time?
No, but it was not a capital in the sense of like Delhi, right? Which was a major kind of all India-wide administrative center.
Wasn't it Bombay? So you have the
But you had what was called Bombay Presidency, right? So Karachi was in effect like a sort of major commercial center, right? But you also had the fact that it was actually for up until 47 part of what's called Bombay Presidency, because Bombay Presidency stretched all the way from, it had regions of Maharashtra all the way into regions of lower Sindh. So this is also the ways in which these boundaries get recalibrated is extremely chaotic. People are going and showing up in offices and doing these things and taking out maps and they make it, right? But it's actually not. The claim is made that this is very rational.
I didn't mean rational, but deliberate.
Deliberate.
Yeah.
But the British are doing is a deliberate.
Because look at the rest of the colonial empire of the British. They didn't do that in the Middle East. They didn't do that in Africa. In other places, like they may not be orderly, but they did it deliberately.
What was actually very deliberate? What was deliberate was, for instance, the idea that Indians, South Asians couldn't think and actually, that was very deliberate. The idea that they are racially inferior, that is very deliberate, okay? What is also very deliberate is the fact that there are entire archives. So for example, that the British Empire, like if you look at Kenya, as the British are leaving Kenya, what happens is that there are entire papers that they are burning at the time and shredding those papers to show that they weren't actually doing any violence against the local Kenyan black population, right? They had risen in rebellion and they were showing that the British did not actually do any violence. So there was actually very deliberate efforts, yes, to suppress any kind of information that was sort of, this sense of that the British were doing some kind of excessive violence. That was very deliberate. I think that here, in the idea of the state coming in this particular instance, what's deliberate is that they just want to get out of there. They want to wash their hands clean of their former Indian empire. What's deliberate is that they actually believe that it's inevitable that all these people are wild savages. they will of course rise up and kill each other, even though that's not what was going on before the British got there. Okay, so these ideas that somehow the populace is savage, these ideas, these are very deliberate, and these ideas have stayed with us in India and in Pakistan. That somehow these massive people, they don't know what they're doing. They are the ones that cause all the violence. They are the ones that are sort of irrational, and the ones at the head of the helm of the state are extremely rational. That is actually that's actually very deliberate, I think, on the part of those who have power.
Ali Saab online wants to ask.
Ji, please.
हेलो
जी अली साहब.
तैमूर भाई आप हमें अली साहब पुकार के शर्मिंदा कर देते हैं लेकिन थैंक यू एनीवे. I think you touched on this in your last response, Sarah, and I think I'm just speculating here. There might not be an answer. So this idea that the British did not have updated information when they were drawing the maps, this is, I mean, I've been familiar with this since I was fairly young, so it's been quite a while. I'm wondering that in the wake of the disaster that was the Second World War for the British Army, especially for London, and in the wake of Churchill's anger against Gandhi, especially after the famine of Bengal, where Churchill famously says, "Why doesn't this Gandhi man die?" You know, I'm wondering if in the wake of such anger, if the drawing of the maps wasn't perhaps some form of last stab, if I can call it that, from the British, as if it were more a result of malice than lack of information, because we see something very similar happening in Palestine right around the same time.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely malice. My point here is that the British are only concerned about themselves. What they want to show to the world is that as they're leaving India, they're leaving it very calmly and a very cool, collected manner, that they've done all this boundary commissions and mapping in a very objective manner. That's what they want to show, and they're extremely concerned about their image, their public image in the world. They're more concerned about that than they are for any welfare of the Indian people. That is my point. And so yes, and they were also at the same time operating with little information, because they did not care or bother to get more information, because ultimately for them, the peoples of India are racially inferior, religiously inferior. So what I'm saying is that we need to kind of think about this malice like in a little bit more complicated way. That A, they only care about themselves because they're leaving at this moment, and B, they want to show to the world that they're doing it in a way that's very sophisticated and calm and cool and collected. But what that actually betrays is the fact that they are not at all invested in any way of preventing any violence or putting anything in place at that time, right? It's a very sort of extremely irresponsible, cruel. It's definitely cruel. Cruel because they do not actually care. So that's what I mean. What I'm saying is I think too often here in South Asia, what happens is that we start to kind of think about it as a deliberate plot, but I think it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Usman has a question.
Okay, I have got few questions actually. My first question, you said that India as a national, as a political entity, singular India, didn't exist before the British. You started with your lecture. So don't you think this phenomenon has a lot to do with the rise of nationalism after post-colonialism, and how people of the world across the globe came to see themselves as a single nation?
Yeah. I mean, basically nationalism is the poisoned gift of British imperialism. We get nationalism. Nationalism is bequeathed to the peoples of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., etc. We are bequeathed nationalism. This is the poisoned gift or sword, you can say, of British imperialism. Because the British Empire itself doesn't make sense without even thinking, when you think about the British don't even become British, as they don't even imagine themselves as a national people until they begin this imperialist project. It's only when they begin to send suddenly the Scots and the Welsh and all of these people, who are very different in their own localities back in what is present day UK. When they come to conquer India, that's when they begin to imagine themselves as British, right? So it's through imperialism that nationalism, in the form that it takes in India and in Pakistan, right? That's how it's ultimately like. It's through imperialism that nationalism is born.
My second question is, I don't know if you'd like to answer it. It's not really related to this talk, but it is in a manner. Like the present situation in India, the rise of BJP, and the idea that they're carrying forward. Now, many people claim, historians like the famous book Saffron Brigade, it claims that when this partition, this whole thing of nationalism, India, Muslim started, there were actually three sort of groups. One was a group led by Gandhi, the secular India, and then there was Hindu nationalism and the Muslim nationalism, which was championed by Jinnah. So how does that fit into the two nation theory or the divide and conquer phenomena, which we both like dismissed, both of them like they were not entirely true according to you. So how does that come into play in this?
Because there are a lot of other political forces. There's the Communist Party. There are like even fascist groups coming into being, right? There's the RSS. There are so many different players, right? I mean, yes, you have these dominant political organizations like the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, but even the Muslim League itself is struggling. I mean, in 1937, it doesn't even get much of the Muslim vote. It's not until 46 that suddenly you have many Muslims supporting the Muslim League, right? That again has to do with the way in which Jinnah is posing himself on the one hand as a savior of the Muslim minority provinces, right? So I mean, there's a lot of moving bits and pieces here. There's regional politics. There are all these sort of other very complicated, I think I'm forgetting your name, sir, in the back, who asked about UP, right? So like, again, politics that's happening at the provincial level are not meshing with the politics at the communal level, right? And those contradictions are what are coming to the fore in the drawing of those boundaries. And the BJP now in India, I mean, what you're seeing is essentially what some historians are calling like quote unquote the unfinished business of partition.
Yes,
right? This
that
is
is
like
what
basically a sense of kind of ethnic cleansing, right? So what's happening there is essentially like, I mean, that, but you have to think that those who are struggling for around that time, right? At that time, I mean, you did not, I mean, Nathuram Godse comes from the RSS. He is the assassin of Gandhi. He comes from the RSS and he kills Gandhi. Okay, so Indian National Congress, that is the kind of dominant nationalist kind of spokesman, as it were, right? And certainly there are a lot of problems there with regards to sort of, I mean, there have been criticisms of the way in which even the Indian National Congress deploys kind of various religious symbolism that alienates Muslims and so on and so forth. But there are a lot of also Muslims who are participating in the Indian National Congress. I mean, Abul Kalam Azad being a sort of very prominent voice, right? And so to divide it also into secular versus religious also doesn't make sense, because you have, for example, so many religious clerics, Muslim religious clerics, who are supporting the Indian National Congress, whereas you have, the Communist Party in India, okay, at this time, is actually putting in for this idea of a separate Muslim homeland. They are actually, the Communist Party supports the idea of Pakistan as it means a protection for, like, basically self-determination for minorities. Communist Party supports that.
So out of that plurality of thoughts and narratives and viewpoints that is going on and the whole political juggling, in your opinion, what is the right narrative of how to explain this process of partition and the onwards history of the two countries?
I mean, I think basically we need to stop looking for we need to stop doing national histories. Like, we need to stop doing this, India is great, Pakistan is greater, India is greater. We need to stop that, like, immediately. And we need to kind of ask ourselves some serious questions about regional, local, what's sort of happening really around us, right? I mean, I think that to kind of do local histories, to think about the histories of people who are ignored and left out of those grand narratives, oftentimes like women, minorities, they're left out, to actually highlight their voices and to really think about history as a much more pluralistic and encompassing type of narrative, rather than like again and again and again, Jinnah, Gandhi, Nehru, like, I mean, endless triad of like rehashed histories, which this nationalist say this one thing, these nationalists say another thing. I think we need to really think very critically about ordinary people's lives and their histories and the stories that they're telling about themselves and about the regions from which they come, about the languages they speak, about the pluralities that they inhabit. Otherwise, we are forever going to be trapped in these national vocabularies.
Excellent. Ji Hassan.
Wasn't the idea of nationalistic unified India inevitable? I mean, was there at the time of Ashoka, but this intense idea of nationalism, this came because of modernism. If colonialism was not over there, then sooner or later we would have felt through it because of the idea of nation state itself.
Right. So as a historian, I believe that nothing is inevitable in that sense, right? I mean, there's nothing inevitable in history because all history turns on conjunctures. There are particular moments where decisions are made by powerful political, rulers. At the same time, there are all these undercurrents of people doing things that may not actually abide by what the rulers are saying. So in effect, there is really nothing inevitable about history in that sense, right? There could have been different decisions taken, right? There could have been, so I don't think that this was somehow, that partition was inevitable. I mean, that's one kind of reasoning that's given. I think that somehow these two nations had already existed before the British arrived. But the British themselves had constructed these categories of Hindu and Muslim and so on.
Not partition in particular. I mean, the idea of a national state, I mean, if it was not a unified, it would have been, let's say, Punjabis, it would have been probably Bengalis or some other nationalists.
But if you look at
like Hyderabad, the Nizam main disagreement was because Bedar was to be given to him back when the British left, so that they could have a Hyderabadi country.
Right.
So
yeah, but I mean, if you actually look at the way in which that state looked like, or other states looked like before the British arrived on the scene, you actually have sovereignty and territory as not sort of unified conceptions.
The borders were fluid.
Yeah, they were look at Kashmir and Punjab. Like, there were shared territories under various different kinds of sovereigns, in which even revenue collection was not ordered by sort of a central state down kind of apparatus, as we think of what the British introduced with all of those district collectors and the governors. And there's a particular hierarchy that gets introduced by a bureaucratic, right? The strong, what's called the steel frame of the British Raj was its bureaucracy, because it was extremely and extraordinarily hierarchical. And there was a very top-down approach. And so those systems of state and governance did not exist in the pre-modern past. And I would not argue that this was all inevitable, because again, there were particular decisions made. There were treaties made. If we look at the 19th century, 1830s, 40s, when these wars were going on, as the French are battling with the British for various territories, there are particular treaties that are made with local rulers, right? Like of Awadh and so on, in which they are, essentially signing away land, right? To the British to protect themselves from the French. So these are particular politics happening. There's nothing inevitable that Awadh is now going to become UP, which is now going to go around now under Yogi Adityanath murdering Muslims. There's no direct line. Does that make sense? So there's nothing, in that sense, I don't see anything inevitable about history in that sense.
Ali wants to ask another question.
Thank you, Naeem. So this is for you, Sarah, but also for the rest of the attendees, if they'd like to share something. I understand this is slightly out of the purview of a lecture on the history of the partition, but one conversation that I found myself in fairly often is about the self-identity or the self-criticism that Pakistanis normally have much more than Indians, and that is that there are many more Pakistanis who are likely to say that there should not have been a Pakistan than there are Indians who want to say that we do not that partition should never have happened. I hope you get the drift. So there are many more Pakistanis who want to say that we wish partition did not happen, and we would have preferred a larger Indian state, even if we weren't the dominant, even if we did not have the rights that we do now. So I'm wondering what kind of legacy of the partition does do Pakistanis inherit that they have this kind of self-loathing, if I can say it like that? What kind of, I know that you delineated several strands of narratives, not just one, but if somebody can shed some light on why Pakistanis are more likely to feel that way.
Why they're more likely to feel that partition should not have happened?
Yes, this if I can call it self-loathing about the identity of being a Pakistani.
But I don't understand the connection here between self-loathing and wishing that partition had not happened.
Because the word Pakistani is a much more novel invention than the identity of an Indian. So it would have, many Pakistanis, especially in the diasporic communities that I've come across, they are much more willing to say that no, we are Indians, or even though there has been no Indian in their families for the last 2 or 3 generations, they are much more willing to overcome the last 3 generations of their families and say no, but we come from India. Why is this negative self-image in many more Pakistanis than Indians?
I would say that the self-loathing is universal across India and Pakistan. I mean, if you're talking about self-loathing, burning, Ahmadis' shops and killing, minorities here. I mean, that is self-loathing. That is like, what is that? That is, I mean, here you have in both in India and in Pakistan, self-loathing. That self-loathing comes very much out of the kind of nationalism that has been inherited, and that is very much a product of colonialism. That somehow, I mean, so all of that. So that is one big problem, I think, the sense of self-loathing. As to whether or not partition should have happened, I mean, I'm not sort of aware of particular statistics of what is said more frequently in India and Pakistan currently at the moment. So I'm not aware of what that sort of particular question you're raising. But as far as self-loathing is concerned, that is actually part of the nationalism that we have inherited, the colonial mindset. So unless we begin to think outside of those boundaries, unless we begin to sort of start thinking outside of India, Pakistan boundaries, then I think that self-loathing will continue.
Thanks, thank you.
Ma'am, one more question. In your earlier lecture, you said that it was the British who actually homogenized, made one entity out of Hindus. There were Shiv followers and everything else, and they were Hindus. They themselves were the first ones to call them as Hindus. My question is that then how come the place was called as Hindustan earlier than the British? So how come this region was called as Hindustan if this word was created, or this concept was created by the British who came later?
No, the idea of Hindustan, okay, so there's the two questions. I was saying that Hinduism, like as a bounded religion with texts, standard texts and standard founders, that idea of Hinduism that in the 19th century gets constructed by the British as like, okay, there's Hinduism, they have a Bible, just like, we have a Bible, their Bible is called the Gita or whatever. Like that idea that there's a bounded religion, right, called Hinduism, that is something that comes about, right, through the British kind of, like the way in which these Orientalists are reading texts and so on and so forth, right? So that's what I meant. And also like the idea of India too is something introduced more from the Europeans. I mean, as for Hindustan, I mean, there's actually somebody who's working on this very particular topic on like this term Hindustan. There's a historian named Manan Ahmad who's actually kind of thinking about this very term and how it's being used and the different ways it's being used. And I don't think it was being used again to refer to the whole entire landmass that is now, or by the 19th century called India. I think it was, I think it was used in particular North Indian contexts at particular moments, right? I mean, the word Hind, al-Hind is also used by the Arabs at an earlier period, right? These do not map onto that same territory of a kind of territorial India under the British. Those are two different and distinct, I would argue.
So perhaps it's more to describe the geographical land based on the Indus,
Yes,
rather
on the
than the
Indus.
religion.
Yes, exactly.
आपका सवाल क्या मतलब?
Yeah.
The area east of the Sindh.
It's more like a Persian pronunciation.
Right, and of course the language that's being used to describe that territory through, yeah, exactly, Persian or.
Not necessarily religious.
Right, exactly.
आपका तो सवाल ये था.
Yes.
And India, if I'm correct, I mean, I don't know if I am, but I have read somewhere that it was because of the indigo dyes that were exported to Europe.
Indus River.
Indus River and indigo dyes. So, and now, because this area, South India was.
Indigo भी इसलिए है ना कि इंडिया में पैदा हुआ.
Yeah. Yeah, indigo color was indigenous to this area, that's why.
यहाँ तो कुछ और कहते हैं. अजरक वालों से पूछें.
अभी भी पाकिस्तान का बीच से स्प्रेड करें इंडस के अलोंग तो वेस्ट का पाकिस्तान मुख्तलिफ ही है और ईस्ट का पाकिस्तान बहुत ही इंडिक पैच है उसमें इस तरह के अफवाह.
That's because of the geographic barrier. Geography has always played a big role in shaping culture, societies, and political order.
Not such a big river.
Indus at that time was a geographic barrier, just like Himalayas has laid between China and Indian civilization. What do you just take this how geography shapes societies in India?
तो आप लोगों को मेरे ख्याल से लेक्चर तो अभी टॉक तो खत्म हो गई.
जी जी मेरा तो
आपका एक वैसे मैंने शेयर किया है वो जो लम्स में आपका टॉक है.
जी जी.
Is it people can go?
As far as I'm aware, yeah, people can go. It's open to
That's what I thought.
लेकिन I think lungs में entry के लिए कुछ
You have to email them, you have to send them an email.
You just have to have an ID card.
उनको बिठाएं मैं आता हूँ.
आपको तो पता होगा.
ये जो सेल्फ क्लोजिंग वाला जो सवाल था मुझे लगता है it also has to do with the diplomatic position and image पाकिस्तान का abroad क्योंकि वो मैं do not want to associate with something कि जो बदनाम ही हो पूरी दुनिया. इंडिया का एक और इमेज अभी तक हिंदुत्व से पहले incredible India वाला image था.
So Indian image is supposedly goes back to thousands of years versus Pakistan.
बड़ी artificial सी construction है.
right.
ये भी.
Credible India tag is come back to the tourism again, obviously.
But that's the tourism. That's a particular kind of public image
Portugal.
creation. Yeah.
Thank you once
Thank
again.
you. Thank you for having me.
और enriching आपके साथ दोनों जो आपने.
I'm never sure exactly how to approach this because I know that everyone here has a lot of knowledge. So I don't mind.
Somebody is a banker, somebody is an architect. So हमारी फील्ड नहीं है.
Nobody knows about partition.
लेकिन मैंने मतलब काफी जो लोग यहाँ पे इंटरेस्ट लेते हैं, दिलचस्पी लेते हैं उसमें हिस्ट्री में, मैं काफी मतलब बहुत सारे लोग ऐसे हैं जो they're not their field but they're so interested in history और पढ़ते भी हैं.
Especially in Lahore, I think Lahore में ये ज़ौक़ है. मुझे लगता है.
But it's most of the time just trying to find an answer.
Exactly.
Question shared by Naeem.
कैसे हम कौन हैं? यहाँ कहाँ से आ गए?
ऐसे ही है.
हम बिल्कुल काशी में हमारे.
जी ऑनलाइन वालों को भी खुदाफिज कहते हैं. थैंक यू वेरी मच. अच्छा हाँ, they are thanking you.